give you this time to ask me any questions you might have.
Yeah, I did ask one question on your last live Q&A about Joseph Campbell, I think, under my other name. So that was really great. Thank you for that. I had like a giant list of questions, actually. So
okay, well, let's tackle as many of them as we can.
Okay, cool. So I guess before I the questions, I mentioned, or I know you had recommended Iris Murdoch's book, The Sovereignty of Good, and then Nishitani's book on religion and nothingness. So yeah, I really enjoyed Iris Murdoch's book, and I'm like 2/3 of the way through Nishitani's now, which is quite a I'm really enjoying that. So those are good. So maybe at the end of this, depending on what we talk about, we might recommend any other books that seem relevant to the topics we go through. Those were great.
Yeah, they both those books had a big impact on me.
Yeah, I guess, well, it wasn't the first question, but since we're talking about it, I was wondering what you make of Iris Murdoch's concept of the good as like a potentially, well, I don't know if you or she would use the word objective, but like a transcendent good that sort of crosses all particular boundaries versus kind of the work that's coming out of evolutionary psychology on the notion, and maybe Jonathan Haidt's work, I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, on the different moral taste buds, on like certain ethical behaviors being more, I guess, genetically predisposed for certain people compared to others. How that would jive with Plato and Iris Murdoch's notion of a transcendent good.
Yeah. So I think the thing I would say there is I would give a very strong, which I think is very fair to Murdoch because it's clear that's what she's doing. I would give a very strong Platonic reading to Murdoch. But I would try and give, I guess, in order to potentially bridge to the domain in which evolutionary psychology works, I would try and give it a more naturalistic reading. So when you read about Plato and the good, or also the one, and especially the way that's taken up in the Neoplatonic, and the fact that it's beyond being, and that it ultimately has to do with being a source of intelligibility, I think of the good as something much more than ethics. I think what Plato means by that is sort of the ground of all of the normative aspects of our cognition. And I think the deepest of that is sort of intelligibility and the ability to connect to realness. So I think that matters is because you can then connect that to people's actual phenomenology. When I don't know what episode you're on, but there's the episodes where I talk about higher states of consciousness, and I have a talk on that. And I'm just reading Foreman's book, Enlightenment. It ain't what it's cracked up to be, But what these people are all reporting, right, is this what I call ontonormativity, the sense of the really real, and how it's not initially, and therefore even primarily, an ethical sense of goodness. It's a different kind. It's that the really real puts a demand on us that seems to be a ground, and like if we don't meet that, all the other norms even the norms of ethical goodness. Like if I was doing all this ethical behavior, but it turns out it was only just in a dream, it loses a lot of its power and purchase on me, right? And so I take what Plato was arguing for, and I think what Murdoch is arguing for is that orientation gives us a sense of being connected to the really real, but not as an abstract concept, but on something that we're, to use some of the language you say you find useful, that we have the perspectival and participatory knowing. Like we know it insofar as we're constantly transcending our biases and self-deception, and that's for me, Connor, that's where the link gets into the ethical. So insofar as it's constantly calling us to self-transcendence, it's in the transformation that we become, it's only in transformation that you become aware of realness, right? Because real is a comparative. You only see that something was more real by realizing that something was a bias or a deception, right? You have to move to a wider frame to see what was wrong in the more distorting, limiting frame. So I think insofar as the good in that sense, and that's why Murdoch puts so much attention on the role of attention in the sovereignty of the good, right? Attention. And so I think as we're attending, paying attention, we're being drawn beyond ourselves. That's affording that sort of deep realization of self-deceptiveness. And I think that's the primary thing, that's the sovereignty, that's the normativity, right? The sovereignty of the good and the way it grounds and makes possible all of our normativities, our epistemic normativity, seeking the true rather than false, our aesthetic, right, our ethical. So that's how I would try and answer that. And the reason why that's important is because that doesn't require a commitment to sort of a, for lack of a better term, a sort of supernatural realm of the forms. It just requires that people can have this experience where they feel that they're overcoming self-deception and getting more in contact by comparison with reality. And since that is something that seems to be universally reported across different metaphysical frameworks, that's why I don't want to commit to a particular hardline metaphysics. I just want to say, well, whatever it is about reality that affords that, that's what I want to talk about. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was really good. So it's kind of like the necessary ground for any ethical behavior to arise, which involves a transcendence of one's own biases and self-deceptive tendencies, which are obviously evolutionarily evolved. Right.
And so that is where sort of the primordial normativity of relevance realization and, the primordial normativity of truth as intelligibility, that's sort of their common source. That's what allows them to, I think, be related to each other at all.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good. I am at the most up-to-date episode of the series. Just so you should be able to.
I try not to presume because it's a long haul, so I try not to presume.
Yeah, I feel like at some point I definitely need to rewatch certainly most of them just because there's so much information. But I know a few of my favorites were like the one on Gnosis, really liked, an existential entrapment. Definitely want to watch that one again. And then one on agape and Christianity was amazing. So,
thank you.
Let's see. I guess one of my questions I've really been wanting to ask is, and I kind of touched on it with my question on Joseph Campbell, but like, what would you say? Because I know you said Romanticism was kind of the first somewhat successful pseudo-religious ideology.
I think so, yes.
And I've always been quite drawn to the artwork from that time, literature and so on. So like, what would you think is the main kind of insight or benefit from Romanticism that we should sort of retain in our current?
Excellent question. And to some degree, I think Jung does point the way towards that. Although there's going to be an episode towards the end I'm going to talk about Jung at length. But I think Jung does point towards, and I tried to do this in the relevance realization stuff when I was trying to come up with this idea of religio. The Romantics point us to the pre-egoic, pre-inferential, right? Like they point us to that level at which relevance realization is working. That pre-rational, pre-reflective, pre-egoic, all that stuff, all the pre's, all right? And I think so there's that, and here's where I have criticisms of their representation of that, but I think that was an important thing they pointed towards. And then they point towards, although they don't help us very much, they're trying to get us to remember, I think, perspectival and participatory knowing. So they've got this, and this sort of bespeaks both their strength and their weakness. They've got this intuitive sense that there is this more primordial aspect of sense making, and that our relationship to it is much more perspectival and participatory. But they don't explicate this side, the primordial aspects of our cognition, with a very good psychology. They have kind of a messed up. They equate it with irrationality and right and you see Jung is more careful there. He understands the way in which all of this stuff can wrap you in a lot of self-deceptive bullshit. So I think he's a little bit more cautious than I see the Romantics being. And then while they point to perspectival and participatory knowing, they don't really give us any sets of practices. They just give us the sort of participation we find within reading the poetry or listening to the music, which is perspectival and participatory knowing. It's exemplifying it. But there's a big difference between exemplifying it and actually affording people the training. So I find that those are the two great insights. But I think, like I say, the way they're presented, I find very flawed. So that's why I have a very ambivalent attitude towards the Romantics. I think they're right to point us towards, the pre-rational aspects of cognition, the pre-egoic aspects of cognition, and to invoke the importance of perspectival and participatory knowing. But they don't give us the functionality that religion used to give us. They don't give us a clearly articulated and viable psychology. They don't tell us how the rational and the pre-rational interact or meet or are related, and then they don't really give us sets of practices by which we can realize that primordial domain in any kind of reliable manner. And in a connected point, they don't give us any sets of practices for dealing with all of the self-deceptive bullshit we're going to encounter along the way. And that was the. I mean, I didn't get to talk about it too much. That was, and I haven't read a lot of Wilber, so I don't claim to be a Wilber expertise, but I did read one essay that was very important in his critique of Jung. And this is his point about what he calls the pre-trans fallacy. He says that Jung doesn't adequately enough distinguish the pre-egoic aspects of the unconscious from the trans-egoic aspects. And I think that's a very important point. So that's a very important point. And I think that's part of the Romantic heritage still at work in Jung.
Right. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Sounds good. I think another kind of related point, one of your points I've been thinking about a lot lately is the notion that meaning inheres in the transjective relationship between the object and the subject.
Yeah, the real relationship.
Yeah, and then your notion of potential being real, and real not being equal to actual, which is kind of a bias in our culture toward form rather than emptiness, you might say, or something like that.
Yeah, do you see the relevance of Nishitani there? I think that's why his book is so brilliant. Yeah, Eastern philosophy is not saddled with the assumption that reality is actuality. It's just not saddled with that metaphysical presupposition at all. And therefore, it has resources to dealing with the experience of nihilism that the West, at its fundamental level, does not have. I think that's just a brilliant insight. That's brilliant cross-cultural philosophy. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I do too. I feel like that's something that I guess the West really has to deal with, and that's, I guess, one of maybe the main thing that makes me somewhat skeptical. I don't know if that's too strong of a word, of like Jonathan Pageau and Paul van der Klee's attempts to kind of revitalize Christianity, if it doesn't kind of address that fundamental insight from Zen and the East that I assume since the 60s, the culture in the West has kind of been able to start integrating, and maybe like Ken Wilber started doing it in some sort of systematic way. But I feel like that's something that, like you said, apart from just a few of the Christian mystics, like Eckhart or Pseudo-Dionysius, who I'm not actually familiar with, seem to have sort of got that. I feel like the mainstream Christianity hasn't. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Yes, they do. And John Scottus Erigena gets it too. Yeah, I think that's right. Now, to be fair to Paul, when I bring up some of that stuff in the non-theism and, trying to reinterpret the sacred as, sort of the inexhaustible fount of intelligibility. He does say his language is very cautious because that's Paul. He says it is not alien to the Christian tradition. He says it in sort of this backwards manner. So I think there's room for dialogue there because of that admission. But I agree with you. I do not see in Christianity, because of its tie to the Aristotelian actuality as reality, which I don't think is Plato, because Plato clearly says the form is beyond, the one is beyond being, in a way that Aristotle never seems to get. I think there are resources in our history in the Neoplatonic tradition, of which, of course, Pseudo-Dionysius is clearly an example, and so is Eckhart, and so is John Scotus Erigena, and others. So I think there's potential there, but I agree with you that classical theism that has been wedded to orthodoxy, I do not think has the metaphysical resources to deal with it. The other problem I see, and this is sort of stuff that's coming out in the discussions I'm having with Jordan Hall, is the argument. I think it's basically Jordan's argument, although I think Jamie Wheel and others and Daniel Schmechtenberg are also making it. The rate at which society is complexifying is such, it's such a difference of degree that it's a difference in kind. And therefore, it's not clear to me that you'll allow me to stretch some words here, please, Connor, that the religions have the evolvability in them to the existing traditional religions have the evolvability in them to meet that demanding complexification in the sociocultural economic environment. And those 2 points are not independent, because I think their inability to evolve, one aspect in which they might lack the evolvability is precisely their commitment to actuality equals reality as one of their fundamental metaphysical presuppositions. So I share that. Now, I try to be, and you expressed it very cautiously, so I'm not misattributing anything to you, right? But so I tend to phrase it as I'm suspicious that they cannot. I don't have an argument that forecloses and said there's no way you can do this, because I do see, like I just mentioned, there's real potential, there's real dialogue there, and it's really happening, and there's real potential within the Neoplatonic aspects of the Christian heritage to draw upon that. I'm suspicious, though, for reasons we're discussing right now, that they won't be able to bring about the reformulation. I don't call it a reformation, because that would be dangerous. But they're not going to bring about a reformulation. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you mentioned in terms of Jordan Hall's work, who I really love his work as well, and looking forward to future conversations with you guys. Just at the speed at which we're evolving. And I think also the phrase you used on one of your most recent episodes, the religion of no religion, is something I keep coming back to on what would that look like, because I know it was very preliminary, obviously.
Yeah.
But I feel like one aspect, it seems to me, that it would need to sort of emphasize compared to most of the world religions we're familiar with, I think is, especially because you can see this with a lot of the New Age movements since the 60s, is like a greater focus on like the connection to nature and ecological sustainability. Like bringing back some of the pre-axial continuous cosmos stuff, and maybe stuff that Ray as well, embodied. And I think this might sound rather odd, but for me, maybe, and I think a lot in my generation, one, at least artwork, even though it was intricately tied to capitalism and everything, that has that kind of world sense of mythos and connection to nature, was actually Pokemon, like Pokemon Go, a few years ago. But, I forget what we call it, not virtual reality, but the altered reality, where people are walking around for a few weeks constantly, like going to parks for the first time, and so on.
Augmented reality.
I was quite in touch with it far before that, and growing up was one thing that inspired me to go explore in nature, and was probably one of the primary factors that made me interested in and concerned about environmental sustainability. So I feel like, personally for me, there's something there that I'd like to explore as kind of one aspect of like a new, I don't know about metaphysics, but some new communal or participatory aspect that a new, like, I don't know if you call it a pseudo-religious ideology, but some sort of cosmological I forget what you used the term with Christopher about like the tree, the canopy, the cosmic
Sacred,
canopy.
yeah, sacred
Yeah,
canopy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's precisely why I'm so interested in Rafe's work, because I mean, there's a sense in which the parkour is direct. I mean, you're not just playing you're actually out there doing something like what you people are doing in these virtual games. You're out there doing this complex sensory motor problem solving, but you're doing it in nature, and so it's directly transformative of your sense of identity and the sense of identity you're projecting onto the world, and how the world is disclosing itself. Yeah, so I mean, I that's why I promote Rafe's work, because I think there's a deep insight there, and he's carefully trying to engineer what that how that will translate into a set of practices, and what it will look like, and how it will integrate with other kinds of practices. That's why he and I talk fairly. That's why I wanted to come to the retreat, because I think I think it's exemplary of doing exactly the point you're talking about trying to get people a set of practices that simultaneously wakens up an identity within them and a way of identifying the world that correspond, and do exactly what you say, get that sense of a connectedness to reality that will revalorize the natural domain, to put it in a sentence. Yeah, I think that's why as I say, I take his work very seriously. That's why I promote it, because I think he's an example. I'm not saying he's got the complete answer, and he does not claim to. He's not doing that. But do I think he's addressing the kind of thing you're addressing right now? And here's what I would predict. I'm willing to sort of make a bit of a prediction here. If people were more comprehensively doing that sort of practice on a regular basis, I think it would be easier to get them to commit to the socioeconomic political change that is needed to address environmental concerns, for two reasons. What pardon me?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I think for one reason is people, as you've heard me argue in multiple places, I'm sure, people will give up. They will undergo huge, losses to their socioeconomic status and if you give them meaning. If you're here, and the evidence for that is just overwhelming, right? And then secondly, right, if people have it's like the reverse of it's like in the same family of thought experiments as the trolley experiment. You know the one, I don't know if you know this one. I gave you this thought situation. You're driving down a road and you see somebody's been in an accident and they're laying on the road and they're bleeding, but there's a hospital literally down the road, like you can see it. So all you have to do is put them in the car and drive them there. But it's a new car. They're going to bleed all over your car, and it's going to cause about $200 worth of damage. Will you do it? And people say, well, of course I'll do it. Who cares? It's $200. I'm going to save this person's life, right? And then you say, okay, and then you take we actually done experiments on this, right? And then you get them to do a whole bunch of distractors tasks, and then you give them this other situation. Hey, I can give you this incontrovertible evidence so that you can't possibly doubt that it's true, right? In any rational sense, that if you were to send this $200 to Africa, you will save this child's life. Will you do it? People say, no, won't do it. Right? And you say, what? Why? They're logically identical. They're propositionally identical, but they're not perspectively and at the level of participatory knowing, they're not identical. You got to get people out, right, doing the perspectival participatory knowing of nature before they'll start making a moral commitment, for exactly that reason.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I talked with Rafe about this a little bit after the retreat on the role of, he had that notion of stimulation versus nourishment, on how most of our modern things that we find appealing are just sort of meeting the surface level evolutionary need, sort of like Jordan Hall's notion of the super stimuli, was it? Yeah. But not getting the actual long-term healthy aspects of it, like sugary foods is the obvious example, of course, preying on our need for glucose. And then he made the argument that video games sort of do that for, especially action ones, for physical activity, and what parkour does in actuality.
Yeah.
Whereas,
I think that's a good argument. Keep going, please. I think it's a good argument. Keep going.
I agree on the whole. But in terms of video games, for me, it probably wouldn't have been the case that I would have trained in parkour if it wasn't for video games, or like appreciated nature and explored nature if it wasn't for games like Pokemon doing it in the first place. So the episode you did with Christopher on the different responses to the meaning crisis, when you guys sort of dipped into how video games give the anagogic. That there's definitely a deep truth to that I could go on a lot about. And it's easy to be sucked into them, but I think they can also be a sort of like a template for inspiration to do that outside the context of the game. I think that they can also play like some sort of healthy role as well for helping people to go and outside and get that perspectival understanding of the natural world and so on.
I agree. I think they could have that potential, and I mean, they obviously do for particular people such as yourself. The question is if we have what it takes to organize. I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't have wisdom-oriented, sapientially oriented video games. I mean, the rituals that people used to do in church and in the monastery they're all simulated things. Ritual is a simulated thing. You're pretending that you come Easter, you're reenacting, you're simulating Jesus' death and crucifixion and rebirth. It's very much like a video game. Keith Oatley argued that theater is the first time people are doing simulation as a way of playing with reality. So I think all of that's there. The question is if we would, if we could, I don't know what it would take. It's sort of a socio-political intent or commitment to reformulate the main ways in which these games are constructed and presented, and the culture by which they're used. So that's mainly what I want to say about that, I think. So if we did this, that was a mistake, and I'm sorry for that. We weren't trying to say the medium per se is doomed. We were saying that many people, which I think there's clear evidence for this, many people are using it in a clearly escapist fashion. They're using it to find, and what we were wondering is, well, what is it that they're finding in the simulation that they're not finding in reality? Now you could, and especially with things like augmented reality that bridge into the real world, you could do a lot to train people there, to prepare them. I mean, we use simulation to train people for the real world, for being pilots and all kinds of stuff like that. So we could design these games to be transfer appropriate, but we don't right now. But we don't, by and large.
Yeah, I'm just gonna plug my computer in before it dies.
That's good.
Yeah, I know we kind of got off track from what I was talking about with Romanticism, but back to the notion of the transjective. I was wondering if one of the benefits from Romanticism that might be sort of still applicable is the fact that it, like you said, in contrast to I guess empiricism or whatever, it assumes the meaning inheres in the subjective, and you're sort of pressing yourself out upon the world, like you said Napoleon was seen as doing.
Yep.
I wonder if, even though the reality of meaning is in the relationship between subject and object, if for people who don't have that grammar yet, the emphasis in Romanticism on finding meaning coming from an internal locus might be useful to kind of counteract the focus on external meaning that, like, consumerism and materialism are a to kind of balance it toward them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think So if I was using developmental language, and there's no hidden contempt in what I'm saying, so don't misread me, please. But I think romanticism should be something we might want to expose adolescents to, and young adults, precisely, at least the good romantics, the ones that have some gnosis in them, like Blake, or perhaps Rilke, because they do exactly that. They get people to step back. They get them to do. Transparency opacity shift and an aspect shift. They get them doing that. As long as you don't stop there, I think that I hadn't thought about that before. That's a very interesting idea. It could be a developmentally useful thing to get people off being focused on the product and get them to somewhat focused on the process, which does start the move towards rationality, at least in the way I'm arguing for it. And I think that romanticism, if used properly in that way, could engender that stepping back and calling it into question the wonder that Plato says is at the beginning of the cultivation of wisdom. Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, just thinking about it aloud right now with you, it sounds to me that if you situated it as appropriate, sort of in this developmental sense, I could see it being useful for that. As long as you were sort of honest from the beginning and saying, this is going to help you get somewhere, and then we're going to move beyond it at some point. Then I think that would be fine.
Yeah, and I definitely felt most strongly during my adolescence that kind of subjective-oriented meaning was. It seems like it would be almost kind of a natural period of growth for people to do that. But yeah.
No, that's very good. That's like what Leo and I talk about when we talk about that phase function fit in insight problem solving, right? What you're saying is romanticism is a very good way of breaking sort of an objectivist framing, breaking frame and making possible alternative framing. Yeah, that's very good. And that stage in life is very much where the frontal lobes are maturing and the metacognitive abilities are coming online. So that would be a perspicacious point to try and intervene with romanticism. That's a very good idea. I thank you for bringing that up. That's a very insight, because I've been trying to think about how could I situate romantic, given my ambivalence towards it. How could I situate it? But your idea, Connor, is very. What's your last name again, Connor?
Dykes.
Yeah, I'll check it. I'll make sure I get it in the email, because that's a good idea, and I want to give you credit for that. That maybe romanticism should be used in a developmental way. That's very good.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of it as a developmental section, so that's your contribution. I was just thinking of it as like a balancing factor.
Wait a second, it is still kind of garbled. Why don't we try the reset? I'll call you back, okay?
Okay, got it.